Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to our regular guest, Justin Parrott. You're most welcome, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me.
Walaikum assalam. And for those who don't know, Justin is currently research librarian for Middle East Studies at New York University in Abu Dhabi and research fellow for the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. Now, he's the author of Finding Truth in the Age of Fake News, Information Literacy in Islam. Very interesting article, and I'll link it in the description below. And in the article, he writes this, just a paragraph I'm going to mention here. There are many scammers, swindlers, and crooks on the web who are out to sell you false promises and shoddy goods. There are professional fake news artists who want to influence your opinion to their own advantage by using targeted disinformation. And there are professional Islamophobes, how true, who specialize in demonizing Islam, its people, and its traditions. By familiarizing yourself with the principles of information literacy, you can protect yourself from all these online predators, as well as from contributing yourself to their nefarious actions, end quote. So would you like to introduce us to the main themes of your article, Justin?
Sure. So the article came about because I am an information professional. I have a master's degree in library and information science, and I have a master's degree in Islamic studies. So I was kind of combining the things I learned into this one article. So broadly speaking, information literacy in the world of library and information science are the skills that you need to discover, evaluate, interpret, and use information, right? So that's the whole chain. You discover the information, evaluate it, interpret it, and how do you use it? So discovery is like using different search engines. Google is obviously very popular, but it's very different from EBSCO and ProQuest and JSTOR and the other big names out there. And each database kind of has its own quirks because it's using a different algorithm. So the discovery part involves a lot of technical skills, right? Especially if you're going to be very good at it. Then you have to be able to evaluate sources. Are these sources credible? What's the counter argument to these sources? Do these sources have a bias? And then you need to interpret that information. So you have to fit it into the knowledge that you already have correctly. People can have access to credible information and then not understand it correctly. And then how do you use that information? What are you using that information for? So those are the broad themes of information literacy, and I teach it in an academic setting to mostly undergraduates. So I'm teaching them how to use EBSCO and JSTOR and ProQuest, how to use library catalogs and how to find books and all those types of things, library services. But information literacy as a whole is going to be, according to the author that I quoted in the article, or I cited in the article, it's going to be the essential skill, the essential competency of the 21st century, right? Same as reading. So, we think of people who can't read as very uneducated and very illiterate, and they never, they don't contribute to society very much, if you can't read. And it's going to become, as we move into this more and more information, in order to participate in society effectively, you have to become information literate. You have to know how to use search engines, how to evaluate sources, interpret the data, and so on. So it's actually extremely important, right, that we have to have these skills, and as Muslims, and then as people in general, right? Because we face this information overload, and we have to cut through all that noise and all the people who lie, because there are people who lie. And people who put out bad information, people who misinterpret information, we have to cut through all that noise and kind of find the truth in all of that. So that's where the title of the article came up. And I wrote this when fake news was becoming a big thing.
Right.
And I'm talking about not just misleading or biased news, but like legitimately fake news, like completely fake websites that were being put up with fake stories.
Wow.
And they were monetizing those things. I think the BBC did a documentary about that. Some people in Eastern Europe, they had these websites, and it was just totally fake news. And so there was that was happening, and they do that at an election time, because they want to confuse people. So information literacy is really basically about learning how to learn in the modern era. So it's learning how to use the internet and how to use databases and all of this information that we have. So, and information needs to be distinguished from knowledge, okay? Because ilm, right, knowledge is defined according to fiqh purposes, or for the purposes of the law in Islam, is to conceive something as it exists in reality. Right. So you have knowledge when your conception of something is in agreement with the truth of that thing, right? That's actual knowledge in terms of law, as defined by law, which is different from khabar or akhbar, which is information, reports, stories, and things like that. There are a lot of akhbar that are reported in the Islamic history books that are completely baseless. Mm-hmm. And at-Tabari, who was the big main Islamic historian, Muslim historian, who wrote that monumental work of many, many volumes, he says in the very beginning of that work that these are the reports of what people said. History can only be known by how people have reported it. And so he ascribes this narrations to the people who narrated and not to the actual people that they're discussing, right? And he said there's some offensive things and there are untrue things in the book, but he collected all of these reports just for the sake of, documenting everything that was being reported out there. Yeah. So we have to have this distinction between knowledge and information, right? And just because you have a lot of information doesn't mean you have knowledge. Yeah. You can know a lot of information, but your conception of reality is completely warped, right? Because of the layers of misinformation that are in the information that you are accessing. And then we need to make I want to make a distinction between the terms misinformation and disinformation. Because people use them online as synonyms, right? They don't make a distinction between those two terms, but they're actually very different, and it's really important to understand that. So misinformation is information that has been published that is just incorrect or it's misleading. And the person who shares that misinformation does not necessarily intend to be deceitful, right? They just, this is what they heard and they're reporting it to you, and it's wrong. And so it's misinformation, right? Now, disinformation is the intentional publication and sharing of information that is completely false. Mm-hmm. And, and this is like the legitimate fake news, right? It's just actual fake news. So we have misinformation and disinformation. And this is also very serious because disinformation is part of the modern day warfare doctrines. So they call it nonlinear warfare, or as part of hybrid warfare, that disinformation is a tactic of war that is being played out on social media, on the internet and things like that. So
can I say on if I may, sorry to interrupt you, on that point. I mean, I know we're not going to get involved in politics because that's a whole different ballgame, but I can't help but note how important this is. That we're in a major war at the moment with in Ukraine, Russia invaded, and the NATO is pushing back, etc. I mean, it's often said, and I think truly, the first casualty in war is the truth, actually. This is always the case. And I just mentioned for the record, I mean, I'm not asking you to give your opinion unless you want to, of course, about the attack on the pipeline, the Russian pipeline that was sending oil or gas or whatever it was to Europe. It was initially blamed on Russia, of course, but NATO blamed it. White House was very clear. Europe was very clear. The Russians did this. The Russians did this. But I read an article in the Washington Post of all places about a week ago. It's a pretty esteemed newspaper. That they were originally involved in exposing the Nixon files, etc. Saying actually most intelligence people, intelligence agencies have now concluded that the Russians didn't actually do it for a whole bunch of reasons, but they don't actually say who the obvious alternative candidate is. And because the obvious alternative candidate is the United States and NATO, because they're the other players in the game. So it looks like that actually NATO did this action, which would normally be called a terrorist action. But the reason I mention this story is because of the question of fake news and misinformation and disinformation, deliberate intentional deception. If NATO did do it, then they're calling out Russia as the culprit. Is just disinformation, deliberate, conscious, because as I said at the beginning, the first casualty in war is the truth, and lies are part of warfare. Disinformation is part of warfare. And so I thought that was a very important example of disinformation rather, and lies in our time now, because if this is true, it is a lie. If NATO can do it then, what else are they not telling us the truth about?
Correct. And I mean, it's a war, it's a shooting war. And so both sides are utilizing disinformation techniques in support of their military objectives. So that's just taken as a given, or regardless of who actually blew up the pipe, that there's going to be all kinds of disinformation put out by governments and other actors surrounding that, because that's just the nature of modern warfare, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an introduction about why this is a serious topic. Information literacy is extremely important for citizens to have, and Muslims in particular, so that we're not misled by actors. And disinformation, I don't want to say it's just governments or militaries that are doing that. There are scammers, selling fake products and, all kinds of Ponzi schemes and things like that you also need to look out for. And that's a type of fraud, a type of disinformation.
Yeah, a lot of people get stung by that. I mean, you get apparently a reputable bank or a utility company emailing you saying, please email and contact us. And it's actually a scam. It's a way of getting information out of you and robbing you of your money. And unfortunately, many people fall victim to this practice, and it's been highlighted endlessly. The BBC have mentioned it. It's a serious problem. It's fraud and, ripping people off big time. It's terrible.
Right. And their tactics continue to evolve, and as the technology evolves, and they're also relentless. So they won't stop. There's always going to be those types of scams that are out there. So we need to equip ourselves with the tools to be able to see through these things and to evaluate the claims that are made out there. So right. That's an introduction about why this is an important topic. So I did that kind of in the introduction to the article, and then I kind of go through three big sections about why or how modern information literacy concepts kind of overlap from concepts in the Islamic tradition. Yeah. So, and one of the first concepts that is interesting in information literacy is what they call attitudinal dispositions. So the student, the seeker of information and knowledge, should have a particular attitude towards how they approach information and learning. And one of those is that, you should be curious, right? When you're researching a topic, you should be curious about getting all kinds of different viewpoints. And I connected that to the concept of being a lifelong learner in Islam. So I brought some statements from very early scholars about how they would seek knowledge until they died, and that the scholar is always a student, and once the scholar stops learning, he becomes ignorant. And that's extremely important now because everything is moving so fast, society is moving so fast, the technology is evolving so fast, and if you want to participate in this society, you have to keep up with everything that's changing and happening.
Very true.
So there's that lifelong learning component, and there's a specific component that is important for us as Muslims, is because we need to distinguish between religious knowledge and worldly knowledge. So that distinction was made by Muslim scholars. I mentioned the Imam Shafi'i, I believe I quoted him, where he makes this distinction. So there's knowledge where we get from revelation. This is knowledge that Allah revealed to us because we couldn't access it otherwise. So that's one source of knowledge. And then we have the worldly sources of knowledge, and that's like the scientific method and logic, rationality, and investigation, all of those types of things. And so they're kind of two different sources of knowledge, and that are discovering the same reality. So we have to synthesize between these two sources of knowledge, right? Because the revelation can never purely contradict what is necessarily known to be true by reason, right? Either the understanding of the revelation is not correct, or the logical reasoning behind it is not correct, and you have to find the flaw there. But because the truth is one, and it is shown to us through these two broad sources, we have to synthesize the knowledge that we learn from Islam, from the Quran and Sunnah, and revealed sources, and then what we learn by observing nature and science and all those other investigative methods.
Yeah. So this is where it's often is it summarized sometimes as akal and nakal. And there's been I've read Ibn Taymiyyah on this. He's written hugely, and so have the Ash'arites, and it's a huge subject in Islamic theology and Islamic thought in general. The relationship between revelation and our minds, the intellect, and the world around us. But fascinating subject.
Yeah, and and I remember when I converted to Islam almost 20 years ago, one of the big talking points that was out there is that Islam is an irrational religion, and we deny science and all this kind of thing. And then as I learned more about our tradition and discovered all of these things, like Ibn Taymiyyah, as you said, it was just preposterous that anybody could make that claim.
Absolutely.
So it was a Islamophobic claim, or an anti-Islam claim people had, that was based, whether deliberately or not, they were putting out misinformation about Islam. So another attitude that we need to have that is mentioned in the information literacy framework, which comes from the American Library Association, by the way, that's what I'm working with. One of the attitudes that we should have is, they say, is intellectual humility.
Right.
Right. So we should be curious, and we should also be humble, because there's so much out there that we don't know and that we can't know. Yes. And then you won't be able to read up on everything, so there's always going to be things you don't know. There's always going to be somebody who knows something more about a topic than you do. So we should be humble like that.
I mean, there's a great quote by Sir Isaac Newton, the great scientist and discoverer of gravity and so on, who was praised for seeing a lot further than his predecessors. And he said, this is an example of humility. I think, if I have seen further than anyone else, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. I stand on the shoulders of giants. So he's aware of what has come before him and his own relationship with it. Isaac Newton being humble there as a scientist, it's a great example of humility.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I quoted it at the end of the article, and it's and another interesting point that we can derive from that is that scholarship is something that is built up over time. It takes many scholars to contribute to a knowledge system, or a field, as we say. So, Newton was just contributing to the field that, building upon what people had done before him, right? Exactly. So they call that in information literacy, they call that scholarship as a conversation, right? So
I like that expression. It is a conversation. It's academic work, scholarly work. It's not just an ivory tower guy just doing his thing. You're in dialogue and conversation with conversation partners, and these partners may have died 2,000 years ago or something, but they are intellectual conversation partners, and that's a very important point, I think.
Yeah, and that's really important to understand, because scholarship is always an ongoing thing. There's nobody who has really the final word on most things, right? The example that I picked from our Islamic tradition is Imam Shafi'i, who wrote Ar-Risala, is the epistle or the letter, and it was about establish a framework of usul al-fiqh, which is the sources or the principles of Islamic law. So he was one of the first people to write on the topic of usul al-fiqh, and he established these different principles, and then everybody after him was responding to him, right? There were Hanafi more inclined people that disagreed with him, and then there were other people who accepted his framework and then refined it and everything like that. And then today, I don't think I've never seen anybody quote Risala, right? Because all of the usul al-fiqh literature after him has been refined and everything like that. So it's a really important like historical work, right? Because he got that conversation started.
I'm just going to turn around a second, excuse me. And the reason I'm getting this out, this is my copy of the book we're talking about, Shafi's Risala. It's an English translation. It's actually very readable. And inshallah, we'll be doing a special program dedicated to this work with a scholar within the next 3 or 4 weeks, inshallah. So yeah, this is the book. Anyway.
Yeah, that's great. There's also another translation, bilingual edition from the Arabic literature series translated by New York University Press.
All right.
And the introduction to that is very good. Right. It contextualizes the work very well. So back to humility, we have this concept in our tradition that humility is to accept the truth from whoever says it.
Yes.
Whether the person is old or young, or friend or an enemy, righteous or sinner. If it's the truth, it doesn't matter who said it. We are loyal.
Or Muslim or non-Muslim. I mean, it's an obvious point to make.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, even very bad people make good points that are true, right? And so, and then we also have to accept the truth, like even if it's not in our favor, right? In general, right? Warfare is a different thing. If you're going to like mislead, the enemy about your troop movements and things like that, there's that kind of deception that is permissible in Islam because it's based on war. The reality of war, which is consistent with Sun Tzu's Art of War, which he says in that book something similar, that war is based on deception, something like that.
War is deception. That's right.
Exactly. So I mean that's the only there are a few cases in Islam where it's permissible to lie or be deceitful, and that's in an all-out like declared war against an enemy.
It's interesting just to a footnote there without going into this rabbit hole, but prominent Christian thinkers and theologians like St. Augustine, for example, was famously absolutist when it came to speaking and telling the truth. He said it was not permissible to lie under any circumstances. And this is a very rigid code, and I'm not sure it's been taken pragmatically terribly seriously by the church, but at least the Catholic Church at least, tend to have a pretty absolutist view. And so Christians are often horrified by the idea that war is deception. How can you say that, Muslims? Well, in the real world, of course, they all accept it. They accept that Churchill in the Second World War occasionally deceived the Nazis because he wanted to gain the military advantage over them, and that was the nature of warfare. He couldn't just tell them, "Oh, Mr. Hitler, I'm going to invade Normandy next week." You just can't do that. So Islam, in my personal opinion, is much more realistic and pragmatic in that particular area about what one can do. Otherwise, the world couldn't function normally. There has to be some kind of flexibility, depending on the context, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the example that I had growing up is people would say, well, if you're hiding Anne Frank in your attic and the Nazis come in and ask where she is, are you going to tell them the truth in that moment? Yeah. So, I think it would be morally, it is obligatory morally for you to lie to the Nazis if you know that they're going to kill somebody unjustly like that. Exactly. So, but there are those
into moral framework. You couldn't actually, and he's probably the most distinguished thing, and he's not unique in the Christian tradition. So there's a great deal of tension there between reality and Christian absolutist principles that they have to deal with. It's not the case in Islam at all, where there's a much more realistic understanding, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one caveat I want to mention there is that when there's a peace treaty or if there's the war has been, there's a truce or whatever, there's no deception allowed in those moments, because part of the truce is that you won't be deceptive towards your enemy. So. That's called betrayal. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said on the Day of Judgment, the people who betrayed their oaths and their agreements and their peace treaties and everything like that, there's going to be a banner raised over them and say, this is the betrayal of Fulan ibn Fulan. This is the betrayal of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. So that is supposed to, for God-fearing people, then that would make us hesitate to betray anybody.
Absolutely.
So we want to accept the truth from whoever says it, right? And it doesn't mean we have to like them or agree with everything they say. But if what they're saying is true, then we're loyal to the truth, right? We're not just loyal to people. And we need to be a confirmation bias is something that is talked about a lot in the library literature. So confirmation bias is that we human beings tend to interpret new information in ways that confirm our assumptions already. So, we have these narratives of the world. We have a story in our heads about how the world works and everything like that. We have to. That's how we understand. And confirmation bias is that we tend to either accept or dismiss new information, whether or not it agrees with what our prior narrative is, right? So, because the experience of somebody presenting new information that disrupts your worldview can be unsettling to a lot of people, and so whether they consciously or subconsciously kind of avoid that. So, if we are loyal to the truth, we have to watch out for our own confirmation biases. So
that takes moral courage. Actually, it's not just a thing you just switch on. Oh, I'm going to, it takes a willingness to actually hear, listen to, reflect on, engage with consciously views which clash with one's paradigm, and that's not. I find that difficult. But when over the years, as a Christian and as a Muslim, to actually listen objectively, and if necessary, to make adjustments to the way I think, and I found that occasionally difficult. One has to make the effort to do that, I think.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you have to go out and find every Islamophobic argument so that you can refute it, because you don't have to go looking for stuff like that. That's going to necessarily unsettle you. But when in all things in our life, if we learn new things and we have to go back and reevaluate our mental conceptions or mental models of the situation. So the next big theme in the article and in information literacy is the concept of information authority. And what this really is about is credibility. So what sources are credible, what scholars are credible, and authority here obviously isn't absolute, but it's important in the evaluation of sources nonetheless, because a very big, well-experienced, accomplished scholar can get it wrong, and some random person on the internet can get it right. That's very rare, and it's not likely, but it's possible, right?
It's possible.
So that's information authority, and I connected that to what Allah says in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of the scripture if you do not know, right? Ask the people of the scripture if you do not know. And this is it was revealed in a specific context, but the scholars, derive this general rule from it that, like, well, if you want to learn something, you go ask the scholars about it, go ask the experts about it. So there's this concept of expertise that we have in Islam. A scholar is not the same as a layperson, right? In terms of who you're going to ask the question. So we want to find out the scholars, and there are all different fields. There's different fields of science. There's all different fields of medicine and history, area studies, humanities. All of these fields, and they all have different types of expertise in them, right? And these are called like knowledge systems. What do you call knowledge systems? So bodies of knowledge that are kind of like separate and distinct from other bodies of knowledge. So we want to ask the scholars, and we want to go to the experts, and it's important to know that expertise doesn't readily transfer. So this is a very important point that confuses a lot of people. because this person has a PhD and they're like they have a lot of knowledge, they know a lot of things, and this person they're talking about is opining upon all kinds of like things that are outside of the scope of their actual expertise, and then their opinions really aren't better than anybody else's when they're talking about those things.
I think it's a really good point. I won't mention who it is, but I know of an Islamic scholar, I mean a real one with a PhD, but also traditional education and learning, very accredited, who made a video about the Trinity and the Incarnation to educate people, and it contains some very basic mistakes. I won't go into the details. I mean, seriously, basic mistakes. No Christian would recognize, educated Christian would recognize what he says as the Christian belief about the Trinity and Incarnation. And I pointed this out to them, and they had the good grace to take it down. And the reason I mention this is just to illustrate your point that one area of expertise does not entitle one to say anything about other areas at all. It doesn't give you any knowledge or expertise whatsoever. In this case, he didn't have that knowledge, but he was humble enough to take it down and to learn some basic concepts in Christian theology, which he didn't actually have, shockingly. And he was teaching others this, and I thought, oh my goodness me, this is not good. So he did the right thing. He showed humility, and he is learning the correct concepts. But there wasn't. I don't know why he did that, but there was an assumption perhaps of just transferable authority to other areas which have their own expertise, which he didn't actually possess. Bless him.
Yeah, and I've noticed that too, that there's a lot of Muslims who quote Bible verses, and they really like misunderstand what the verse is saying or how it's understood. The Christians have their own tafsir of their Bible. Absolutely. Right? So if you really want to know how they understand that verse, go look at what their commentators said about that verse. And then they're really, a lot of Muslims, they're looking at translations and then kind of interpreting the plain face value meaning of the words, and not actually how that was like historically understood. What does the Greek say? What does the Hebrew say? Yeah. And so on. So, Christian theology is itself its own field. And that's one of the reasons I don't talk about it very much, because I recognize that I don't read Greek, I don't read Latin, I don't read Hebrew. I could find all those things if I want. I focus on other things, but you really need to. We really do need to be humble in the sense that when we recognize that this is a knowledge system that I don't have access to, and I don't really have the ability to comment on things within it until I study it, right? So, and that idea of transferable expertise is all over the place, because there's somebody who gets their PhD is like a scholar in this really niche like field, usually, as compared to the entire academy. Yeah. And just because they have that PhD in that particular thing doesn't mean that they really know anything about anyone else, So, and a good example is scientists, physicists, chemists, biologists who comment on theological matters, and they just have they're just totally lost because they just have not studied the field at all.
Yeah, I mean, famously, Richard Dawkins, the Oxford biologist, who is an expert in his field. I'm not commenting on that, but he thinks he's competent to comment on details of Christian theology and biblical interpretation. And Christian scholars often complained to his face that you simply don't know what you're talking about. You haven't studied it. You don't have the training or the knowledge. And I think for him, though, because many people would say he's quite arrogant, he has such disdain for theology in general that he doesn't feel he needs to understand it to be able to critique it. But of course, that's a very hubristic view to take. And if he is going to talk theology, he needs to understand what he's talking about. So he's probably the most egregious example I can think of. Unfortunately, there are many others who do the same.
I was thinking about Sam Harris.
That was his other one.
If you have access to like academic databases, I would say go read a few book reviews of his book in academic literature, and it's quite interesting. So we have this idea of authority, like we're looking for credibility. We use that to evaluate the source. I also related that to the verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that if a fasiq, like a wicked person, a troublemaker, comes to us and with some news that we have to verify it, right? Or
Yes.
we have to confirm it.
Yeah.
And the story behind that is there was a man named Walid ibn Uqba, and he was sent by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to a tribe to collect the zakat from them. And for whatever reason, he was scared of them, or he thought they were going to harm him. And he came back and he told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that they rejected that, and that basically they're going to war with you. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was obviously upset about that, so he sent Khalid ibn al-Walid, radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, to investigate. And it turns out that that story was not true. Wow. So the verse came down in response to that. So it shows us that the credibility of the witness, the credibility of the person making the claim, is essential to evaluate the source. And in the Islamic courts, this process was called ta'dil, right? We do that in Western courts as well. You want to evaluate the credibility of the witness, the credibility of the claim. Yes. Yes. And so we're doing that when we're evaluating websites, when we're evaluating journalism, when we're evaluating science. We're looking at the track record of this particular person or this particular institution. And we use all that to evaluate the source, right? And all of those things, right? It's not just that everything the New York Times says is credible. It's not necessarily the case. New York Times is more credible than somebody's like random blog, but this goes into another important point.
Sorry, just the famous thing, without going into history and politics again, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We were boldly told by virtually all of the Western media, government, security services, that Saddam Hussein was armed to the hilt with weapons of mass destruction and was an imminent threat to the West. Complete balderdash, complete fiction. Yep. Misinformation at best, disinformation very likely. And the New York Times, everyone else dutifully reported this as fact. And and there are many other unfortunate examples of serious, how should we put it, errors in the West and everywhere. It's not just the West. I'm not saying Russia gets it right or China is always transparent in its truth telling, but it's just to be fairly universal.
The weapons of mass destruction claim in Iraq was disinformation by the government that is fed to the media. So. Yes. And then the media reports it, and they'll say anonymous person, high intelligence official said such and such, and are those claims really credible? We don't know. They use anonymous sources. Is that a legitimate journalism tactic? There's a whole bunch of things there. And I don't want to get too much into politics.
No, I know. I'm getting into it. I'm not expecting you to, but I'm involved just to mention examples just for the record. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got to make it relatable to the things we see. So the next important concept is evaluating the author's perspective and the author's potential bias. And the example that I use for my students when I'm teaching them, undergraduates, is the Wall Street Journal versus the New York Times. So those are the big two papers in the U.S., the two biggest. The Wall Street Journal will give you the right-wing view most of the time, and the New York Times will give you the left-wing view most of the time. So when you are reading the news from either of those sources, you have to understand that they're coming from a particular perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong or it's false or it's fake. It just means that they have their own narratives, and their editorial boards fit their stories into those narratives.
Yeah, as I say with the BBC here, another global broadcaster, who the way they reported on the World Cup in Qatar, they refused to broadcast the opening ceremony because they were concerned about LGBT, and just the way they highlighted certain liberal causes repeatedly throughout the reflection of the news was extraordinary, and clearly they were very, very biased. And yet there isn't this consciousness often that it is. It's a national broadcaster, that they have balanced, unbiased news, but their selection of topics and the way they promoted certain agendas was clearly very biased, and to the detriment of the Muslim world consistently. And that was a particularly horrible example, I thought, recently.
Right. And the reality is that there are no non-biased news sources. Exactly. Every news source has its own bias, whether it's right-wing, left-wing,
Yes.
Different ideologies, independent people have, grifters, they all have their own agenda, right? So,
Yeah.
you have to take what they say in that context, right?
Yeah.
And I think the same is true with scientific and medical literature, because science and medicine are funded.
Yes.
Does that affect the outcome of the science that they're doing? Yes, it does. To what extent, that's debatable, but you have to keep that in mind. If a drug company funds a study, is that the same as a truly independent group that is studying the effects of a drug, right? So there's author perspective and bias, and that goes into the evaluation of information authority, right? So the New York Times has some credibility, but they have a perspective as well. So, keep that in mind. And there are different types of authority, as we said, there's scientific authority, medical authority, and so on, because these are all separate knowledge systems, that have their own rules and terms and everything like that. And then the last point about information authority is that we want to avoid the argument by authority fallacy. So if big so-and-so scientist said it's true, it must be true,
But Justin, can I push back on that? I read your article, and I remember when you said that. And your point is a very, very common. Perhaps everyone agrees with you. I'm not sure I do, because there are times when we just have to accept authority because it is authority. For example, I go to my doctor, and he diagnoses after careful investigation that I have this illness or this cancer, or whatever. I'm not going to say, well, I'm not going to accept what you say, because that would be just deferring to you as an authority. Of course I should, because he's an expert, and that's his role, is to give expert medical diagnosis. So I'm trusting blindly authority because I don't have the expertise. So I think it's not a fallacy to trust authority because it is authority and argue from authority when we're talking about experts who are recognized authorities in their field, and we simply don't have the knowledge. But there are other occasions, of course, if I was to blindly follow what the BBC said or the US government or Moscow say, that would be very foolish just to blindly accept it, because they are an authority. They're a legitimate authority of, in America and Russia and Britain. So I think the argument needs to, of course, you do actually make some more nuance in the article, but I think the common point needs to be nuanced a lot more. There are times when we can trust authority because it is authority and accept their ruling, and that's not a fallacy. That's good sense, I would argue. And you make that. I'm not being. I don't want to be unfair to you. But I think the argument, as it properly presents itself, I think is itself a fallacy.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, and I appreciate pushback. So don't worry about that. So we I don't think I mentioned this in the article, but we have this concept in Islamic law. It's called taqlid.
Yeah, we did mention it in the article, taqlid.
So I mean, we all have to do that, right? Because we're not all going to be experts on various topics, right? So we have to defer to authority. We have to recognize authority and defer to it when we can't investigate ourselves. The difference is if you go into a field and you're going to become a mujtahid in that field, which is somebody who doesn't follow the authority without investigating the evidence for it, then you can question authority. Right. Yes. But generally, you can trust people with authority who have good track records and everything like that. I'm not saying don't trust your doctor. You might need.
I'm not suggesting you did, but I was just giving a straw man argument to push back. That was all.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, so that's authority, and then I get into the idea of the roots and the branches. So this is usul and furu. So the usul are the foundational principles of a particular field, and fiqh has its own usul, deen has its own usul, and these are the terms that scholars use. And so we have foundational concepts, first principles, and then everything that comes after that is branching out from that. So this relates to systematic, structured learning. So if you were going to become an expert in fiqh, for example, traditionally, what you would do is you would start with the basic primer in the field. The Shafi'i fiqh, for example, you start with the basic primer, then you would move up to the intermediate works where they talk about intra-school disagreements and the reasons for those and the evidences. And then you have these advanced works like Imam an-Nawawi's Majmu', which has, mentions the rulings of the other schools and their evidences, right? And Ibn Qudama's, the name is Mughni, right? That's the Hanbali one. So he mentions opinions from all different schools, their different evidences, and then he gives his own opinion. So you would follow this kind of structured way. And that's what you have to do in order to achieve expertise. And so if you don't want to do taqlid, if you don't want to just blindly follow authority, and you actually want to have expertise, then you have to do this structured learning. And we're talking about academic disciplines. I'm not talking about just like news media and stuff, right? But scientific disciplines, history, things like that. They all have methods, right? They all have foundational principles, and then they have the branches that come out from that. And then terminology is also really important. So in information literacy, the framework, or well, they're not in the framework, but we're librarians, we talk about controlled vocabulary. So what the Library of Congress does is when they catalog books, they bring books in and they have to document all little pieces of information about the book. That's called metadata. They make this record is full of metadata about the book. So data about the book, page numbers, all that kind of stuff, everything you can record about the book. And then what are the search terms that people should use to find this book? And this is called controlled vocabulary. So they set subject terms that are official from the Library of Congress to this book or piece of information so that people can find it in the database. And in Islam, is similar, I think, is that we have this concept of mustalaha. We have this concept of terminology. So the four fiqh schools, they all sometimes they use the words the same, sometimes they don't, right? So if you are an expert in Shafi'i fiqh and you know nothing about Hanafi fiqh, you might be confused when they're talking about fard and wajib, because they both mean obligatory to the other schools. They're synonyms, but for the Hanafis, they have a specific difference, right? And a lot of scholars, they will talk about like our sheikh said this, the two imams said this, and they're referring to a specific person that you would just have to know who they're talking about. So all knowledge systems have controlled vocabulary. Like these are the terms that they've agreed upon to describe the phenomenon in their field. And it's related to terminology. What terms are you using? What search terms do you use, right? When you're searching in EBSCO or ProQuest, for example, you need to know the words that scholars are using to describe the thing you're looking for, right? Even we have these official keywords that come from the Library of Congress and that are in part of the library databases. That's how you can find a book in the catalog. And then you have author-supplied keywords as well. So they're words that are not officially part of the Library of Congress vocabulary, but the author has supplied the keyword because they think this will help you find it.
Yeah. Just to say on a slightly different point, you're talking about using key terms to access literature and so on, and that's very helpful. But on a kind of related term, I'm reminded in the kind of comparative religion field how words, the same word, can have quite different meanings, semantic fields as well, depending on the religion. So what a Christian might mean by God or by salvation, for example, is actually quite different potentially from what a Muslim may mean. And this kind of easygoing use of language can misinform. So, a Muslim wants to know what, a Christian thinks about a prophet. What are the prophets? He or she will come up with maybe a different definition than the Christian would. So the point there is that language can be a false friend. We say that in, when I'm speaking or learning French, for example, there are certain terms that sound really, I know what that word means, but actually it means something completely different in French, even though the word's the same. And same in conversations, we can misunderstand each other if we don't ask, well, what do you mean by when you say God? What's your concept? Mr. Christian, when you say that, or Mr. Muslim, what do you mean by God? Tawheed, obviously. We can't just assume there's an equivocal meaning because the word is the same. And that's often trip people up, in my experience. We've got to dig a bit deeper to, the details. Otherwise, we're going to misunderstand each other, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's why terminology and definitions are so important. So any scientific field, any medical field, they all have these terms that they use, right? Yeah. So if you want to know what they're talking about, you have to go look up those terms, right? Yeah. You can't just assume on face value of the word that you know what they're talking about. I'll give you a good example that I found the other day. I heard that in 2022 there was a Nobel Prize awarded to a group of physicists who conducted an experiment that was related to quantum entanglement.
Oh, yes. A fantastic. That, by the way, folks, if you don't know what quantum entanglement is, do Google it. It's the most extraordinary phenomenon in the universe, I think. But anyway, it's not boring.
Yeah.
No, I think so. Well,
I lost my train of thought. Why was I bringing that up?
Sorry, I interrupted you. You talk about quantum entanglement, and I was just saying if people didn't know what this actually refers to, it's
right. We're talking about terminology. Okay.
Yeah, action at a distance, where two things can still relate it could be light years apart, and they still interact at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. What was really interesting about that, because there were a lot of videos on YouTube about saying how these scientists prove that the universe is not real, and it's like what. What do you mean by that? And the two opposing views in science, as I understand them, is that realism is that, a particle has a specific property that is true wherever it is, whether you're looking at it or not. And if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, it still definitely fell. That's realism.
Yeah.
And then anti-realism is that if the tree falls in the forest and nobody heard it, then it wasn't there at all. So that, those are the competing theories, and these headlines that people were putting out there, that these physicists prove the universe isn't real, is just like really confusing until you understand they're talking about these really specific theories in physics, right?
Quantum events rather than trees in woods. It was a very specific. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I do have a bachelor's degree in physics, so it's kind of my hobby. I decided not to go all the way in physics, but it really it makes you. I think it makes you appreciate the mystery of the universe, right? So
absolutely.
So that's why it always fascinated me. And Sir Isaac Newton, I was always a fan because his physics were actually really easy to do. Even Einstein, I thought, was easy to do. It's Niels Bohr and the quantum mechanics people and the electromagnetism people. That's when it gets crazy.
Really, very crazy.
Extremely difficult, though. But I appreciated Einstein for how beautifully elegant and easy his theorem was to understand.
Yes.
So, we talked about scholarship as conversation. And then the last point I have is that when we really want to understand a topic, that we actually need to seek out opposition information. So, and I'm not saying go out and find everything that Islamophobes talk about so you can, argue with them. Not everybody has to do that, right? But in the news, for example, the story will come out. It's framed a particular way. This is the perspective that they're putting on it. What's the counter perspective, right? What's the disagreement with that? What's the other evidence for that? And that interaction between the claim and the opposition, back and forth, that's what creates knowledge, right? Because somebody makes a claim and then somebody opposes the claim and presents new evidence. And then somebody then opposes that claim and presents new evidence. And theories get built up that way in this conversation between, ideally between scholars, right? So that's why I think opposing information, at least being able to access opposing information is really important. And even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he repeats many of the arguments of the idolaters. He says, وَقَالُوا, and they said this, وَقُلْ, and قُل, saying to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you say this, right? This is their claim. This is the counter argument, right? Yeah. And there are many examples of that, right?
I think just on one example, I was going to mention how important it is, if we want to avoid misinformation, disinformation in the news about the world, is to read multiple sources. So not just rely on one news source, but read a diversity of viewpoints as well. So not just the Washington, what do you got, the Wall Street Journal, that's it, but Al Jazeera as well, or whatever, just to get. But on your specific point about quoting people accurately, well, one of the impressive things I discovered about Ibn Taymiyyah was when he was interacting with his opponents, whoever they were, he would quote them, obviously, that they're allegedly what they said in writing. Professor Al-Tubki, actually, who's come on blogging Theology, looked into it, and in fact, he checked, or every time we could check that he had quoted someone else, Ibn Taymiyyah was meticulously careful to quote them accurately and fairly. So in other words, he didn't distort or lie or leave out crucial bits to straw man the opponent. He was meticulously careful to be fair to them, even though he completely disagreed with them. And I thought, wow, what an honorable moral thing to do. And it shows that a man has integrity when he can cite his enemies accurately. It's very tempting to distort them and mock them, or subtly distort what they say to make them look silly. But Ibn Taymiyyah didn't do that, and he's been checked when he can be checked, and he's always been found to be accurate and fair in his reportage. I thought it was an interesting point.
Yeah, it's one of many reasons why I really like Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. He's one of the scholars that I have studied. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on him, but I do have read quite a bit. So having this opposition information is important, or at least being able to access it. And I, for me, just personally, like I want to know, like, why do the flat Earth people think the way they do?
Yes.
And you can find out that their theory is like kind of absurd for many reasons, but like, why do they think that, right? So, in general, like suppressing information is not a good idea, right? Even if it's bad information, like we have to counter it with the truth, right? Many reasons why suppressing information can be very, very problematic. And then one more point that we skipped up here is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "It is enough sin to repeat whatever is heard. It is enough sin or enough falsehood to repeat whatever is heard," right? Yeah. And this is gossip, right? Or, oh, I heard this, and did you know that? It's like gossiping and rumoring and things like that. And we really need to be careful with social media, because especially if you're taking your news from social media, is that in any given day you will find 30 stories that are there, or maybe not that much, but 10 stories, right? And unless it's your job to analyze all these things, you probably have a job doing something else, that the effort that it goes to verify everything in that story can be, is without the scope of what we can do, right? Yeah. And at some point I realized that, I'm on Twitter, right? And I'm getting all these news articles and from different perspectives. And then I realized that, well, a lot of this stuff, I don't have the time to verify any of it, what these people are saying on Twitter and social media. So you don't want to repeat something, I think, right? You don't want to share something that you can't verify, right? Because, you could be passing off a lie or a falsehood, and, because you didn't verify it. So I would just put that warning out there and really be really careful about the things that you share, right? Because it can be misleading. So,
yeah, and it's a sin as well in Islam.
Yeah, yep. It's kind of like being an accessory to lying, right? Yeah. So yeah, and even if it's true, like even if it could be true, like you're sharing like celebrity gossip, like what's that? Like, we shouldn't be gossiping, right? A lot of the news is gossip. It's just, there's no benefit in it. It's just like for entertainment, and the infotainment issue also has, I think, corrupted a lot of the information, or a lot of the perspectives that people have, is because, and this goes back to Pulitzer. So I didn't cite this article I didn't cite this Harvard article in the article that we're talking about, But there is an article in the Harvard Business Review. I don't know if I mentioned it to you or somebody else, but it's the title of it is "Why the News is Not True," or "Why the News is Not the Truth," or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And
this author wrote back in the 90s, and he was explaining how in the time of Pulitzer, right? Everybody's heard that name, Pulitzer Prize. He transformed journalism into like with narratives and characters, and you're telling a story and everything like that. And then this author at Harvard was kind of showing how all their debates were distorted because of this sensationalism that the journalists came up. At the time, they called it yellow journalism, which was based off of the Yellow Kid comic strip. So they were kind of like, these newspapers are just comic strips. They're just, they're shoddy, sensationalist, everything like that. But a lot of the news is, at least in America, it follows that format. It's telling you a story. It's bolstering its particular narrative. I mean, real news is boring, right? Real news is like a bulletin board. These things happened. I mean, it's just boring, but it's turned into this huge business of infotainment. Yep. And then it's not actually informing you. They're trying to condition you to accept their perspective, which could be warped, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, again, one of the reasons why you need to at least be curious of what the opposition is saying, and seeking out different sources, diversifying your news sources. And yes. Also, I would say you make sure that your news sources, when you're diversifying them, and you're not picking a whole bunch of left-wing or a whole bunch of right-wing sources. Like, pick ones that are from the left and some from the right. There are these apps now. I saw one, I forgot off the top of my head. If somebody's really going to go in deep into this news media world, they have these apps that actually aggregate the news. And, and so you'll find a story and it appears in 100 newspapers. And when you click on that newspaper, you can see how the headlines are all framed in different ways. So some are framing it in a left-wing way, some are framing it in a right-wing way, some are more neutral. And then if you click on that article, and it would tell you, give you some stats about that particular news outlet, where their funding came from, and what their political bias is, and what their news guard rating is, and everything like that. So there's so much out there that, like, if you really want to get into all of it, you need to be using apps like that, because it's just so complicated, right? And the funding, I mean, if you're getting your news sources and they're all being funded by the same organization or the same person, or that could be problematic. So that's not a different perspective. It's just a different outlet for the same perspective. Yeah. So you want to, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you quote someone called Amber Benham, very helpful, who provides us with some guidelines for evaluating websites. And they say, ask yourself, who wrote this article? Who sponsors the site? Is there an agenda to the content? Is it complete, accurate, and current? What kind of page is it? Is the URL appropriate for the kind of content on the site? And they go on, the internet is a powerful tool with a tremendous amount of information to offer, but verify is still the name of the game. When you take all that you've investigated into consideration, count on your instincts to tell you whether you can trust the information you found. Don't take shortcuts, and remember, buyer beware, even if it isn't money that's changing hands. And I thought that was some great advice for evaluating websites.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I got this. I think the author, he or she, wrote that in 2012, so 10 years ago, or a while ago. So it's probably even more of a problem now.
Yeah. I couldn't work out from Amber Benham if this was a man or a woman, but of course maybe we shouldn't ask that question today. But anyway, yeah.
Statistically, it was probably a woman if it was a librarian. So, but that's just statistically true. So, okay. But it doesn't matter, because man or woman, what was written is true, and I accept it. Yeah. So, So that really basically goes over everything, and I just want to reiterate that this is extremely important. If you're not literate in these skills, or at least have some of these skills, and you have a healthy dose of skepticism about things that are claimed out there, it's really easy to be misled in a number of ways, whether somebody's selling you a fake product or making you a fake misleading political claim or any kind of those things. And so, these skills are going to become as important as reading has become in society, because people who, when we live in democracies, right, they have to vote. And how are you going to evaluate candidates if you have no idea to get information about, to get varying perspectives on the candidate that you're supposed to be voting for, right? If you don't even know how to do that, then how can you make an informed vote, right? So in that regard, citizens are going to have to do that to protect yourself from scammers, to be able to participate in society. And then these information systems, they're just going to become more complex. They're going to become, artificial intelligence is going to be introduced into them. It already has, but that's going to take off. And, in keeping up with all of that, is going to be a challenge for a lot of people. So that was the reason I wrote the article. The original concern was about fake news, because that was on the rise at the time, but it turned out to be something really wider than that, and more important than just identifying fake news. Can be applied to many other situations. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Justin. Just to remind us that you are the author of Finding Truth in the Age of Fake News, Information Literacy in Islam. And as I say, it's linked in the description below. Do read it. There's lots of juicy bits there to help us really wise up about how we need to assess and assimilate and understand, news and so on. So, Justin, thank you very much for your time. Your expertise has been most interesting and instructive.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, as always.
Until next time, take care.
Until next time. Walaikum salam.